So my name is Pietro Michelucci. I'm director at a small research institute in Ithaca, New York called Human Computation Institute, where we explore different ways of configuring humans and machines to solve problems. And among other things, we have some citizen science projects. So I just thought I would go over, let's see if this works, the idea for this workshop today. So the basic structure of the day is we're just going to spend about 30 minutes setting some context about what the basic ideas that we're exploring here, CrowdBots, and situating that within the broader context of why we care about something like CrowdBots and how it fits into a framework of hybrid intelligence. And we have some other speakers here to talk on those topics. Then we prepared an activity. We went to great lengths to create these magnetic pieces to support this activity, and we got them all the way to Denmark, and then we managed to leave them at the guest house this morning. So members of my team are at the library right now. Oh, they were successful. Okay, so we have pieces. They're not magnetic, but there are some magnets on the board. So we'll talk about that later. And so the idea is we're gonna do some local brainstorming at the tables to try to kind of get used to this idea of thinking about process models where we have humans and machines in the loop and what we might be able to do with that. And then in the last 20 minutes, each table will share these ideas. We'll get feedback from the group, and then we'll wrap up. So that's the basic and simple idea. Right. So as I mentioned, we'll have a couple talks here. Also, I want to mention that my colleague Laura Onak from Romania is here virtually, sitting with in the laptop that Ravish is holding over there. And she's actually responsible for a lot of the CrowdBots work we've done. She couldn't be here because of the political situation and staying to support her family locally in Romania. But fortunately, she's able to join us this way. And again, she's been a very substantial contributor to this work. So I'd like to go ahead and begin by introducing Jennifer Couch.
Well, hi, everybody. So I think it's sort of lucky for me that the keynote speaker this morning introduced citizen science from an environmental perspective, and so from and a U.S. environmental perspective, I think, for the most part. So I'm from the National Institutes of Health, which means that I support research in areas having to do with health, but also basic biomedical research. And rather than talk to you all about citizen science, I normally use this slide to sort of introduce citizen science and why citizen science is important in biomedical research, but I think you guys probably know all of that, and so I'm going to kind of come around it the other way around, which is to introduce what we're doing in areas like data science and artificial intelligence and why some of that still needs human input and knowledge and intelligence and context and all of those things that come so well from citizen science. So the mission of the NIH is at the bottom of this screen. That's the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and our mission is not just to promote public health, but to understand the basic fundamental mechanisms that underlie health and disease, and to fund research across this whole spectrum. So there's been a whole lot of work in artificial intelligence in the last few years. And I mean, artificial intelligence is nothing new, as you all know. It's been around for years and years, but it's accelerated hugely in the past few years. And that's because the methods have changed. These deep learning methods that have come out of other fields are now being applied in the biomedical space. There's big improvements in hardware, and there's tons of data coming out, right? So clinical data, but also basic biological data, catalogs of gene interactions, that sort of thing, and also, real world data, right? Data that often comes from people like citizen scientists. This just shows the growth in grant applications to my institute, the Cancer Institute. That's one of 27 of the National Institutes of Health, right? So this is just the one that focuses on cancer. But you can see this sort of a curve occurs across all of biomedical research. This is the number of grant applications that we get per year that focus on machine learning or deep learning or artificial intelligence. You can see it sort of rocketed up in the past few years. That comes in a whole bunch of different areas, but mainly it's had a huge impact in areas like image analysis, so medical imaging, and also like imaging of things like cells. And then a lot of sort of natural language processing, right? Trying to understand the text that's in things like medical records. But we're starting to see it sort of creep into all these other areas in biomedical research. And the reason I'm showing you all this to begin with is because I think it's going to come around at the end that without doing this without context around it, without sort of knowledge and without understanding what questions we're asking with AI, we run into trouble. So there's a whole lot of challenges to artificial intelligence in biomedical research. And I won't go through these all, but yeah, you guys are seeing that too. Well, the gist of that bottom section is that without applying AI correctly, what we really need to be able to do is sort of trust what comes out of AI. And because it's often sort of a black box, this issue of interpretability and explainability becomes really important in biomedical data. And so we see papers like this, where this was an algorithm that was trained on medical records. It was trained to do a good thing. It was trained to look for people that were at high risk, that needed to go into a high-risk management category within the hospital. But the algorithm very smartly looked for expenditures, right? Because that's a marker of risk, right? People that have risky health conditions spend more on medical care, except that our medical system is uneven, and there's often a sort of a socioeconomic or racial bias in it. And so what it was doing was artificially lowering the importance of some of the folks in that database when it was applied, because it was using expenditures as a proxy for risk. And so we often see this kind of mismatch between the data that the algorithm was trained on and the data that it encounters in the real world when we use it in a place like a hospital or a different community or on a different population. And then we see the flip side of that, right? Which is that when we do things like interpretable deep learning, where the black box is sort of cracked open and we can look at why the algorithm is doing what it's doing. So, you let the artificial intelligence run, let it make its predictions. And when it makes the correct predictions, in this case, it was looking at images of cells, right? Looking at whether the cells were going to be metastatic or not. So when cancer moves from one site in the body to another, cells break away, and most of those cells die, and a few of them metastasize and stick somewhere else in the body. If we could know which one of those cells were going to stick, which of the thousands, and which ones weren't, it would be really, help our understanding of the way that the process of metastasis works and how to interfere with that. This algorithm was able to look at images of cells that you and I and the experts look at and cannot tell the difference between, right? The cells look exactly the same, and it can tell which ones are going to be metastatic or not when they're put back into animal systems. But the clever thing in this paper was that they cracked open that black box and looked at why. So what were the parameters that the model had really focused on to understand that? And it had focused on features of reflectivity of the cell. Well, what on earth does reflectivity mean? Well, if you're a scientist that understands those cells, you know that the reflectivity on the surface of the cell correlates with things like stiffness and its ability to stick to things. And so that sort of helped to explain the mechanism. But it was important to have both the AI and the human in that system. So we do a lot of programs like this where we bring people together from different worlds. This one was machine learning and people that understand biological mechanism to bring together these two areas of expertise. And how am I doing for time, by the way? Okay. So one of the other areas that is obviously really important in things like artificial intelligence is not just having diverse data, but having a diverse set of data scientists and people that are sort of working with the data. And so this is just a program that the NIH is supporting to increase the diversity in the world of data science, and specifically artificial intelligence. One of the areas that comes up in every single workshop we ever run on artificial intelligence is this issue of ethics and the social and ethical implications of using biomedical data and artificial intelligence. And so we wanted to sort of systematically go through and figure out we know there's bias in the data sets, right? We know the data sets are incomplete. We know there's all sorts of problems with the data. And we know that there's bias in the way that people are interpreting those models and using those models and everything else. And we know that there's issues with consent forms. But there's other sort of ethical issues lurking out there. And so we wanted to sort of systematically explore what some of those issues might be and do what one of our investigators called create a culture of ethical inquiry, right? So rather than think about sort of punishing people that are using algorithms inappropriately, think about whether we can use the artificial intelligence more appropriately to begin with. And so we ran a whole series of what we called Microlabs, looking for like who have we not been talking to that we should be talking to. So legal people and ethicists and that sort of thing, the ones that are outside the biomedical research space. And then we brought those folks together and thought about what sort of key opportunities and challenges there were. And then we sort of focused in on some of those opportunities. And I won't go through this big complicated slide here, but the issue was they raised a bunch of important issues around the ethics of artificial intelligence. And we chose to focus on this one up here in the upper right corner, which is thinking about the data ecosystem. So that's the way that biomedical data, moves as it moves from, collection through various processing steps and is integrated together and used in different ways and ultimately used for artificial intelligence, and thought about the ethics around that. And so we ran a program that brought together, ethicists, artists, lawyers, all these sorts of folks with biomedical researchers, with artificial intelligence experts, to get them to sort of brainstorm around this and ideate around some pilot projects. And that just happened. So we've just launched some pilot projects that came out of this opportunity. And I think that's where I'm ending and handing it over to the next thing. I just want to sort of make the point that I've talked only about artificial intelligence here, and that's sort of a tee up to the idea that this all works if we do it in a context of sort of knowledge and contextual information, and we ask the right questions, and we listen to the right people, and we think about the data in a way that has that sort of contextual awareness. So on to hybrid intelligence.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Jennifer did a great job of addressing part of the why question, which is a very important part. I'm going to switch gears now and see if we have this queued up. Yep. Okay. So I'd like to introduce Jacob Sherson.
So in honor of my host, I'm wearing this I'm advertising for Stall Catchers, which is our host game. And you all had a chance to win it yesterday if you came to the Open Science and you played their game. And I didn't win it, but my 10-year-old son did, and I stole it from him. So that's why. Okay, I'll try to see if I can stand here and stand a little bit here so that I can see everyone. I will zoom out a little bit. So we talked about AI. I'll zoom out a little bit and then zoom in again on citizen science. But the broader context is AI is developing. We heard that, but we are also seeing that as we have these proof of principle demonstrations in the lab and we taking them into the real world, they start to fail really on a massive scale. So here's some statistics that sort of demonstrates that. If you take something, 70% of all AI projects generate little impact. Of course, that's only within the study and everything, but it really does highlight that there's a huge problem in applying AI. And one of the challenges that we would need to do is that, first of all, we need to build a human-centered sort of AI system that can work and that sort of builds on human strengths. And then second of all, we really need to understand how to deploy them. And the deployment is really one of the things that I think that we can work on also in the citizen science field. So just my view on what has been happening sort of in the last 5-6 years is that we've seen the sort of this remarkable transition from something that we can call human in the loop, where all of the AI that we have today has some sort of training data associated with it, and then there's a sort of a dream of going from in the loop to on the loop, so placing sort of the human only in the verifying stages, and then to out of the loop. So that's one trend, and that's sort of you can say the computer science dream of making it autonomous. It has a lot of potential to be disruptive. We have seen that, but it also has a lot of drawbacks that are starting to emerge. And so bias, we just talked about. De-skilling is something that you lose our skills that we have. And then there's something called the value alignment problem, which is that we really don't know how to put what we want into the algorithm, and then it starts doing what we didn't know what it wanted to do. And then we see catastrophic things happening when we put it into the real world, Facebook and things like that. Okay, so another one is really to say, okay, there's another path, and the other path is what is now becoming sort of more and more named the human-centered approach or human-centered AI. And there's a lot of development to try to formalize that as a field. And one of the things I want to sort of advertise for is for instance, the work of Snyderman, where what he says is that we can actually sort of human control and machine control is not sort of one axis, but we can actually realize and aim for high degrees of automation and high degrees of human control at the same time. That would be a fantastic system where the human is in control, but we are utilizing all of the power of the AI. And so what you, in human-centered AI, it's sort of grown out of HCI, where you treat the algorithm as a tool. So it's not an agent. AI is not something that it can do on its own. It's a tool. And one of the prime examples that are being taken out is the digital camera. So the digital camera, it doesn't seem so fabulous or anything, but it actually has a lot of features in it. And we are still the ones taking the pictures. So it really sees how we can use AI to augment our abilities. So that sounds all good, and it is really fantastic. But what I'm sort of seeing is there something in between those two things? Something where we sort of use AI to fundamentally disrupt our workflows and use all of the power of AI, and at the same time have this human-centered approach, and that's what we call hybrid intelligence. So what we're focusing there on is sort of a little bit in between, where we're saying, okay, well, what if the machine has some agency? What if there is some power on that behalf? But then we always focus on something that we call mutual learning, which means that we try to build into the systems that the user always becomes cleverer when they are using the tool. They become augmented. On the other hand, as we are developing, using the system, the computer also sort of learns from that and sort of augments. So where and when is it that we need to use that? That's what the headline should have said up there. So here you can sort of see just a small table of human skills and the machine skills. And I think maybe I have a highlighting of one of the lines here. So the soft skills, the creativity, the flexibility, that's sort of what we need to focus on. And the really cool part is we don't even understand that in humans yet. So if we can start to understand that better, formalize it better, then we can start to put it into algorithms. What we need for that is what you can say a shared language between how AI thinks and how we humans think. And it's, of course, this is a metaphor because AI doesn't really think, right? So, but we can sort of say, okay, well, we could take as a metaphor sort of system 1, system 2 thinking processes, which also is a little bit of a metaphor in the psychological field, but at least, we can think about saying, we are either sort of intuitive or we are analytical in our mindset. And then there's a trend that says, okay, well, we could also think about machine thinking fast and slow. So we can think about whether, in some sense, we can say, well, is the machine sort of applying pattern recognition and training on data and sort of intuition, you can say, or is it rule-based and is it sort of the old school AI that came before all of the deep learning paradigms? Of course, just like on this side, this is sort of a little bit of a folklore. On the other side, this is also a folklore. But what's important is that we, or our users, are used to engaging with people where you think, is this person sort of intuitive or is this person analytically thinking? And they are also going to want to think about whether the tool that they are using thinks in that kind of way. So it's a metaphor that we can use for designers. And it's really interesting here, some sort of small cases where, so the question is, should machines, so normally in humans, if you correct your errors, then it builds trust in you, right? So I am able to recognize my own flaws, and then sort of I am learning, and then I have more trust in you in the future. But should we build the same things into our systems, into our AI systems? Because if the machine comes back to you and says to the judge and says, all of the things that I gave you advice previously, they were actually wrong now, but now you should trust me. Does that build trust or does that disrupt trust? Those are the kinds of questions that sort of come out of this way of thinking about machine thinking, you can say in that way, or applications of that. So what we need to do is that we need to somehow find out how to design these systems. That's challenge number one. And then the other one is, how do we make all stakeholders adapt and adopt these kinds of systems? And I think that's maybe a slightly overlooked challenge. So for that, we have, over the last couple of years, tried to put together a number of sort of experts from various different fields to explore this hybrid intelligence from various different angles. And Pietro was one of the main collaborators also on that. So emerging out of that is sort of, here's a sort of a picture that you can say that you have the human-computer interaction field, then you have sort of the AI, and here was the computer controlling everything. Here's the machine sort of being a tool, and then in the middle we have what I call human-centered AI. There's something called hybrid intelligence up there, and what I think is that this comes as I call it management there, but sort of the deployment fields that are used to sort of looking at how things work in the real world. That's what we need to be designing. And here's sort of my 6-step process to both developing and deploying these kinds of systems. And for instance, if it's in a corporate context, we also work with companies, then the first step is actually that we need to have what I call an HI pact between the management and the employees that says this process is supposed to end in something that upskills us all of it, and I commit as management to be measured on my success on whether I'm upskilling and not just whether we are making more money. And that can build trust. Okay, so that was a little bit of a out there and not so much citizen science, but I still have 2 minutes. So what we have been doing now is now that we sort of start to see what hybrid intelligence is or could be, then we're sort of reimagining the field of citizen science through that lens. And why should we do that? Why is all of this important? Well, one of the things, I talked about corporates, and it's really difficult for us to convince corporations to put in the money to actually understand human skills well enough to develop these systems. And so this is where citizen science is unique, because we have a participant-centered focus. It is not enough for us to just solve the task efficiently. We also want our participants to gain something from it, to grow something from it. So it's built into our core success criteria that it is not just an efficiency, but also a focus on human growth. And so that's why I think that if we now take up this challenge, we can actually sort of show the path towards developing AI of the 21st century, human-centered AI. So what we've been doing is then sort of to situate the field of human computation, collective intelligence, artificial intelligence, hybrid intelligence within this field. And then I'll just very briefly flash for you what we sort of look at as, let's say, if you take all of your citizen science projects and then try to go through the exercise of thinking about it as if we were a machine. So all of your participants are machines. They are doing machine computations. I'm now trying to formulate it in a computational language. Then from all of that, it's not that it can. Then you will actually see how many of them are out of reach for modern state-of-the-art algorithms, and we will have more sort of respect for that. And if you do that, at least when we did it, it sort of magically falls into a space where there's a certain set of optimization or citizen science challenges that falls within challenges that we can call optimization tasks. Those are the games. Quantum Moves is ours. Folded, you may have heard about. These are games that are sort of well-contained challenges within a mathematical description, and they lend themselves well to something called reinforcement learning. And then there's a huge class of problems in citizen science where we have taken snapshots of reality, and then we want some sort of consensus mechanism on it. Could be pictures from stall catchers, from galaxies, or from nature. And so it is no longer that we're searching for the truth, but we're trying to tap into sort of the common sense and capabilities of the crowd. That's also supervised learning. And then we have this whole field where the data hasn't even been taken. We need people to go out there in the real world and acquire the data. And if I talk about that in a computational sense, then I need a smart robot. It needs to navigate an environment. It needs to think about where to deploy a sensor or to activate a sensor. If, for instance, you have water samples, then you need human skills like common sense to say, if I deploy a sensor right here, it may get stolen or it may get disrupted. And all of those things are processing that we need to be doing that machines cannot be doing, but the equivalent would be intelligent sensors or robotics. So that hybrid intelligence sort of framework gives us increased respect for what the humans are doing and possibilities of building that interface in. And so that's a very brief introduction to what we then try to do, systematize that, take any kind of project that we have, and then you have sort of participants, you have training, you have a task up there, you have some sort of AI, and then there are lots of arrows up there that either can be on or off, and whether one or other of these arrows are off, then that gives some different kinds of citizen science projects. And I hope that's a good introduction to the workshop that's coming next. So I don't want to talk about our own projects so much, but these are sort of one of them. They fall sort of in natural science or social science investigations, something that we call Games for Good, where we sort of have activities where we can sort of engage the crowd in discussions about political matters or social matter or value-based matters. So that's our view. And then we have a very talented team, and I want to thank all of those, and then all of our collaborators also for this, that have made it possible. Thank you.
There there are three of us, three of us also in the audience from the group, in case anyone has questions later. It's myself and Janice and Mess. If you raise your hand here.
Oh, there are people back there. Hey. Okay. Well, thank you for that impassioned talk. And I don't know about the rest of you, but as we kind of venture forth into this brave new world, it does give me a degree of comfort to have this kind of a vision, as explained by Jacob, that keeps humans in the loop and starts to kind of decloak, what's happening underneath and give us access to that, so we can control what that is. And so that's kind of where I'd like to go next in the conversation. So thanks again to Jennifer for providing some sort of motivation for this, and to Jacob for giving a high-level framing of hybrid intelligence and what that means to us. And now, this isn't showing up. And here's our sausage making. I'm glad you can see that. Maybe I need to just, let's try this.
Exactly.
Almost.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're always looking for collaborators.
Thought that was the activity for the day there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, crowdsourced proposal writing. I like it. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about our citizen science project, and only enough to kind of set a context for what we're going to do next. So let's see. So our citizen science project, called Stall Catchers, tackles this problem in Alzheimer's disease. So for a long time, it's been known that there's reduced brain blood flow in Alzheimer's patients, but we haven't really understood why. And I had the good fortune of meeting some really impressive biomedical researchers at Cornell University who are trying to understand why this happens. And what they found is that when they take mouse models of Alzheimer's disease, about 2% of the brain capillaries are stalled. And when they look at the downstream effects of those stalled capillaries, there's about a 30% overall reduction in brain blood flow, which is exactly what we see in human patients. And what they found was that when they introduced an immunosuppressant drug to these mice, it released these clogged capillaries, and blood started flowing again, and the cognitive symptoms abated. The mice actually got their memories back, which is kind of an interesting thing to say, because if they got them back, it means they were never really gone in the first place. And so this was a tantalizing result, but the problem, of course, is that if you can't give an immunosuppressant, it's like giving an animal AIDS, and they can't survive. So the next goal was to try to find a safe treatment that would still release these stalls. So why citizen science? So the first question so this is Chris Schaefer and Nozomi Nishimura in the mining biomedical engineering department at Cornell. And I asked Chris, so this all sounds very promising, but why are we talking? And he said, it takes us about 1 week to actually collect the data to answer a single research question, and then 6 to 12 months to analyze the data in the lab. So it was one of these kinds of, from the citizen science perspective, an opportunity to crowdsource potentially an analytic microtask and divide and conquer. And in fact, we've, through Stall Catchers, which now has, after 5 years, over 43,000 participants, with 50 to 100 different people playing every day, we're able to accelerate this research by about a factor of 5, maybe even 10 now. So we're answering research questions every month instead of every year, which starts to make finding a treatment more tractable. And actually, we've had some pretty exciting results recently in this vein. So if you've never played Stall Catchers, this is what it looks like. We draw a little outline around an individual capillary, and then the participants move this little green slider button back and forth to see. It's like a movie, and you see whether blood's flowing through the capillary or not, and then just make a binary decision. It's either flowing or stalled. And this is something that machines get right about 85% of the time. An individual human gets it right about 75% of the time. But as you know, we can apply our wisdom of crowd methods to combine many answers from different individuals into a single expert-like crowd answer, which actually exceeds the individual accuracy of the lab technicians. So these are one of the challenges we faced at the beginning of the project was to answer this question, to validate this approach and say, is there some number of people whose answers you can combine to actually get this target level of performance, which was about 99% sensitivity and specificity. And what we found was somewhere between 15 and 20 people we were able to hit that target, which was really exciting because it was sort of a proof of concept. We knew that it was indeed possible to crowdsource expert-like performance in this task, but 20 people is a lot. So we refined our aggregation methods. For this one, it was actually, we just asked 20 people and then took their average answer and then set a threshold. It's very simple. This was a more sophisticated approach that involved modeling each user as a sensor and looking at their sensitivity and bias and then incorporating that into kind of a weighted combination of their answers. And today, so we validated it at 7 people, but today it's usually 4.5 people who answer about a given vessel. So after 4 years, we had 1.2 million crowd answers and derived from over 12 million individual annotations. And we saw an opportunity to run a machine learning challenge in partnership with Driven Data and sponsored by MathWorks. And there were 900 participants on 50 teams. And what we were hoping is, now that we have all of these human-generated data, which is one of the models Jacob was describing, we can use those data to train a machine learner and possibly automate the whole thing. Not so much in the spirit of hybrid intelligence, in that then we might not need the community anymore, the human community anymore, but it would speed up the analysis dramatically. And in the end, with the 50 teams that participated, the top 3 teams, I think, were performing above the 90%, maybe 95% accuracy level, which was very good, but not quite good enough to replace the crowd. And it just seemed a shame to take these 50 machine learning models and just say, well, these are better. Thanks for trying. OK, we'll try again in 5 more years. And so we wanted a better alternative to that. So one of the things we noticed in comparing the human and machine-based performance. So here we have the blue bars are the 43,000 stall catchers players, and the orange bars are the 50 different machine learning models. That there was actually great diversity in the response bias of the machines, and that it mapped fairly closely onto the human bias. And then when we dug a little deeper and we looked at the top 3 winning models, we found that they were all sort of fundamentally different. They used different training approaches. They had different architectures, and then their response process was also different. So it wasn't just kind of spurious differences. There was something kind of fundamentally different about these, just the way that different people think in different ways. So we had this idea. What if we took one of these models and we gave it agency in stall catchers and let it play along with the rest of the humans? And then we would compare the hybrid groups where you had humans and these machine learning bots forming an expert-like answer to the human-only expert-like answers. And what we discovered is, so this is an equivalence test, and we were comparing this to a previous study. So we were trying to measure equivalence where if you're on the 0, that represents perfect correspondence. And what we found is that actually the new hybrid groups mapped better to the original human group than the new human group, which gave us kind of a new basis and confidence for thinking, maybe this hybrid, these hybrid cohorts could actually, work. And by the way, the bot we chose for this was Laura, my colleague that I mentioned earlier, was her bot that she produced in the competition. And she actually built her whole master's thesis around this project, and that's why we invited her to join the institute. Now she runs this for us. So then, we did a follow-up study. This time, Laura ran this whole study, and the question here is, okay, we tried this with one bot. It looks promising. What if we have 3 bots? So we enlisted the contributions and collaboration of the other 2 top 3 winners. And what you might notice, and these are preliminary findings, they're not published yet, and we're still really trying to dig through the data to make sense of this. But everything on this side is closer to the human-like performance from a prior study. And so the one more distant one is the bot only. That green bar represents a cohort of only bots. So what we take from this, again in a preliminary vein, is the notion that as long as you have at least one human, so thank goodness we're not obsolete yet, as long as you have one human contributing in a cohort, that you can still achieve this very expert-like level of performance. So it felt like, okay, now we can breathe life into these bots and have them be material contributors to what we're doing. So our hope is now to run a true validation study and see whether we'll actually incorporate bots into stall catchers on a regular basis. The other thing I want to mention is along the way, and by the way, Libusha Vepshek, who's also part of the team sitting over here, who's been working with us on AI ethics and related topics and has a cultural anthropology and computer science background, which is a great combination, was actually engaging our community of participants to see how they felt about these bots showing up on the leaderboard. Because these bots, you can just turn up the server power and they go faster and faster and they move up the leaderboard. And I won't share those results now in the interest of time, but it did have an impact on how people felt about it. And then there's this question, do we show the bots on the leaderboard? Do we hide the bots? If we hide the bots, do we mention that there are bots playing? So there are these kinds of secondary effects of doing this that need to be considered. So I think what we want to do next is we want to consider how we can, as I mentioned before, kind of open the black box. Because by opening it, so we have the increased transparency that both Jacob and Jennifer alluded to, that there's greater interpretability, that we have greater access when we look at a model to say, are humans actually in the driver's seat here or not? Do we want them to be? Is that appropriate in this case? And what's actually going on? So here, this is a process model that describes how stall catchers works and how we took the output data from the human crowd, a learning algorithm, Laura's machine learning model, trained it with those data, got a new model, and then used that model as part of a hybrid crowd to now analyze the data even faster. So I'm sure many of you know of iNaturalist. It's a citizen science app where you go and collect pictures in nature, and then you get help identifying it both from other members of the community online and also aided by AI algorithms. And so here's a representation of iNaturalist using the same kind of pictorial depiction of the process. So just as kind of a look ahead, soon we're going to be asking you to generate some notional models that represent different configurations of humans and machines toward improved modeling and data processing. And then, okay, so we have one other example here, which is Galaxy Zoo. This is quite a canonical use case, I think, in citizen science. This is, the deep sky survey, and you've got all these galaxies. And again, a divide and conquer kind of approach where we ask members of the crowd to learn how to classify galaxies, and then you show them a blob and ask them, is it a spiral galaxy? Is it a barred galaxy? And this has, I think, been a wildly successful project. It's actually made new discoveries. And in this case, so you've got the crowd-generated data. You have an improved machine learning model. And here, actually, at a certain point, you say, OK, we're just going to have the AI now doing the classification. But we're going to constantly improve that AI model. We're going to still have the crowd do analysis, keep looking at these galaxies, and keep feeding that into the AI model. But the AI model is already good enough to be analyzing this on its own. We just want to keep making it better. So it's a slightly different twist on this. I imagine some of you have your own citizen science projects. Some of you might be considering your own citizen science projects. Or you just might have some ideas about interesting ways to marry humans and machines together to do information processing. So what we'd like to do is just provide you with this kind of, I can leave this up here as sort of a framework for how to describe these ideas. And so I guess the first thing I'd like you to do is just, we'll have you work as tables on this, and we'll get some materials around to you to work with. But maybe just take 5 minutes to, at each table, go around and introduce yourselves to each other. So why don't you go ahead and do that for 5 minutes, and then we'll get you set up with some materials.